You may have heard of an idea called thin places. Thin places. Thin places are an idea that we get from Celtic spirituality, both pre-Christian and Christian Celtic spirituality. That is the spirituality of the Irish, the Scottish, and the Welsh. The idea of a thin place is that there are certain places, certain locations in the world where the boundary or the border or the wall between the material world that we live in and the spiritual world, that boundary is somehow thinner, hence the name thin places. And so in these locations, according to this tradition, God is easier to comprehend. God is easier to see and hear. God's presence is easier to know. In these thin places, the spiritual truth of our world is easier to discern and ascertain. These are, in other words, special, holy, sacred places. And according to tradition, they're actual sort of physical locations on earth that, for whatever reason, are thinner places. Now, in our reading today, in Genesis, and I'm going to scroll back right up just in case we had a lot of readings today, so maybe you've not totally have in your mind our first reading. In our reading from Genesis today, we continue to follow Jacob, and we met Jacob last week, and we saw Jacob having some problems with his brothers, some problems with his family. We're catching up with Jacob much later. And he's now traveling alone in the wilderness, and we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about exactly why he's traveling and maybe why he's alone. But he's traveling, moving from one place to another. And night falls, so he has to camp. He camps out under the stars. He sleeps out under the stars. He lays down, he's been traveling all day, he goes to sleep easily and quickly. But while he's sleeping, he has a dream, a strange dream, where a stairway or a ladder comes out of the sky. He sees angels ascending and descending. And then all of a sudden, God's presence is there. And God speaks to Jacob. And God offers a blessing, God offers protection, and God offers a promise too, that although Jacob is traveling alone now through dangerous territory, he will survive and he will have many heirs, many descendants to come after him. Jacob awakes all of a sudden. And even though what he received was good news, we're told that he was afraid. The Hebrew verb here is actually something like shaken. So we could say Jacob awakes and he's shaking in his boots or maybe shaking in his sandals. It's a strange and profound experience. But ultimately he recognizes it as a good experience, and so he renames the place Bethel, which is Hebrew for the house of God. Jacob recognizes that he's met God in this place, that something important has happened. And so it seems like maybe Jacob has stumbled onto a thin place, right? A place where heaven and earth are a little closer, where that boundary between the spiritual world and our world is a little thinner. Indeed, it's thin enough that that stairway broke right through. Maybe Jacob has found a new thin place. But I have to say that the more I thought about it this week, the more troubled I was by that conclusion. Something didn't quite sit right with me about thinking of Bethel as a thin place. It took me some time to figure out what was bothering me. You know, when we talk about thin places, we do normally mean specific geographical locations around the world. In the Christian tradition, some of the most famous thin places are, for example, the islands of Iona, the islands off the coast of Scotland, where there's a monastery and a retreat center. Many people go on pilgrimage there, believing it's a thin place. Or we might talk about a place like the Camino de Santiago, a series of pilgrimage sites in Spain, where again, many Christian pilgrims will travel, hoping to have that spiritual experience. And of course, many Christians would treat Jerusalem and specific sites in Jerusalem as a thin place, a place where we can know God's presence, hear God's voice more distinctly than in other locations in the world. And that's just in the Christian tradition. Other religions have their own thin places, their own sacred holy places, temples or monasteries, mountains or forests, where the adherents of those faiths believe that that boundary between the spiritual and the material is somehow thinner, and where God's voice, God's presence is easier to know. And what I realized was bothering me about this idea was it seems that too often we think if we can go to these locations, we can expect to meet God. It's almost like we can schedule God's presence to show up for us, right? If I plan a retreat to go to one of these places, well, I had better hear God's voice while I'm there. What troubles me is that what we learn from Jacob today is the exact opposite, right? Jacob was traveling alone in a place expecting nothing. This is what we learn in our reading. He was just traveling from point A to point B. He wasn't expecting to meet God. He was just traveling through this land. And he was leaving his family actually because things were a bit tough at home. He had deceived not only his brother, as we kind of heard about last week, but he had also deceived his father. He had left with his brother angry at him and his parents making demands of him. He was traveling alone through the wilderness, a dangerous wilderness with dangerous animals and dangerous people as well. He was looking at an uncertain future. I think the last thing that was on Jacob's mind was that he was going to meet God. Jacob was surprised by the thinness of this place. He wasn't expecting God at all. I have to say, I love the idea of thin places. It really appeals to me. This idea that we can go to a certain place and somehow be closer to God. But I worry that in seeking out these thin places, we think that we can control or schedule or expect God's presence. And what I'm hearing from Jacob today is that's not how it works. Jacob's experiences teaches us actually the exact opposite lesson. It's when we don't expect God. Maybe when we don't even really want God's presence. It's then that we discover God, right? Jacob was fleeing problems. He was estranged from his family, and indeed he may have felt even estranged from God. And it's then that God shows up. It was at that time that God revealed God's self. Not when Jacob wanted it, but when Jacob perhaps didn't want it and certainly didn't expect it. We learn from Jacob that God will be known precisely when we are not in control, when we don't expect God. And indeed, this got me thinking, I wonder if it might be better for us to think about thin time rather than thin places, right? I'm not sure that there's anything especially holy about the site of Bethel. It would be used in later generations as a site of worship. But I think what mattered was that Jacob was in a thin time. There was something about that time that made him more open to God's presence. The fact that he wasn't in control, that things weren't going really well, that he couldn't expect things to go well, couldn't expect to know God's presence, that actually somehow made him more open to God's presence, strangely. Now, I think that we actually hear something similar today from Paul in his letter to the Romans. Now, this section of the letter to the Romans has a lot going on. This is definitely one of those passages where you could preach 50 different sermons. The whole second paragraph is so rich, and there's a whole nother sermon that I've given at another time on that. But what caught my attention today was in this first paragraph when Paul says, "When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness." This is a strange thing for Paul to say. I think Paul is talking about how we can know God's presence, how we can enter, we might say, a thin time. I think what Paul is saying is that when we pray, and when we really authentically, honestly pray, strangely, it's actually not us praying. It's the Spirit bearing witness. That when we authentically, honestly pray, God is the one speaking. In other words, prayer is not about us doing something. It's not about us scheduling or expecting that somehow we can speak to God and make God listen. It's just the opposite. Real prayer, authentic, honest prayer is about stepping back, stepping aside, giving up control, or maybe just recognizing that we were never really in control to begin with, and allowing God to speak to and through us. I think Paul is telling us that our job in prayer, our job when we're seeking to know God's presence, is actually to get out of the way of the Spirit. Just as ultimately Jacob had to get out of the way and let God speak to him at Bethel. Now, last week, I was talking about prayer as well. And I suggested that when we feel exhausted, when we feel distracted, when we feel hopeless, when we maybe are actually least interested in praying, that's actually the time when prayer might be most important and most powerful for us. And I think today it's fair to say that Jacob, when he lies down at the site that he will name Bethel, he's probably feeling exhausted and distracted and maybe even a bit hopeless. He's on a long, arduous physical journey, and he's got all kinds of problems with his family, all kinds of uncertainty about his future. And yet it's at that time of exhaustion and distraction and hopelessness, it's then that Jacob meets God. It's then that we should pray. And I hope that maybe some of you joined me last week in praying more and setting some time aside to pray. But this week we learned some further important lessons about what prayer is and what prayer is not, right? Prayer is not a technique that we can use to control access to God. Prayer is not a magic spell that we can use to force God to speak to us or be present. Prayer is also not some new work. It's not some new task for us to add to our list and then check off. Prayer is something more vital, more organic than that. And prayer is also not a shortcut to holiness or righteousness. Far from it. Prayer is none of these things. Prayer is about making space, or I'd rather say, making time for God to speak, to step back, step aside, give up control, and allow God to act and to speak. Now, I want to be clear that even if we pray, quote unquote, the right way, even if we're praying really well, even if we're stepping back and giving up control, most of the time, I don't think we're going to have an experience like Jacob had at Bethel. We're not going to hear this divine voice. We're not going to have that deep epiphany. But if we have that discipline of setting aside that time in a regular way, I do think every so often we will have profound experiences of God's presence. And here's the thing, it'll always come when we're not expecting it. God shows up, and God is always a surprise. Now, I want to also be clear that although I was a little critical of the idea of thin places, like I said, I love the idea of thin places. And I want to be super clear that if you have a thin place in your life, if there's somewhere you can go and you somehow feel God's presence more strongly there, whether it's a church or whether it's the bank of a river or whether it's a pilgrimage site overseas, if you have a thin place where you can go and feel God's presence, that's a wonderful thing. I certainly would never suggest that we give that up. But I also hope that we will remember that in truth, everywhere is a thin place, or at least everywhere can be a thin place, because the Spirit of God is present in all places and in all times. I don't think that prayer, I don't think that discerning God's presence is necessarily about finding those special places. It's about setting aside that time, creating for ourselves some thin time. Step back, step aside, give up control, and let God act and let God speak. And the truth is that we can do this anywhere. This is what I think Jacob actually discovers. Not so much that Bethel is a holy place, but actually that wherever Jacob goes, wherever he runs, whatever problems he's facing, no matter what, God is present, wherever and whenever he might be. And prayer is about understanding that everywhere is thin, that every time can be thin. It's just that most of the time we don't notice it, right? But prayer teaches us to see the world in that way, to see the world as thin, to see the world as transparent or translucent, and to begin to see God's light shining through every place we go, every time that we live. Now, I hope that this hour that we share from 9:30 to 10:30-ish every Sunday, I hope that this hour on Sunday is one of your thin times. I hope that it is. But I also hope that all of us will be finding some thin time throughout the week, not just on Sundays, but throughout the week. Even if it's just a few minutes here or there, I hope that each of us is finding some thin time to set aside for us to step back and step aside, to give up control and to let God speak.